Morning, good afternoon, good evening. We might just wait a few more minutes as we're letting all the participants coming in. I'm just watching them pop up. So we'll give it a minute or two more. All right, we might make a start. Um, as I said, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. We have participants from, I think, all the way from UK, Europe, Nigeria, all the way down to New Zealand. My name is Fraser Cargill. I'm the Regional Director for Language Set. I'm based in Australia, so I'm in evening time zone. But look, thanks very much for everyone for joining this webinar, which I think is a really important topic at this point in time on global student mobility trends, given everything that's happening in our sector, pretty much across the world. So I think it's going to be a really interesting presentation. Yeah, the presentation itself is going to be for around sort of 40 minutes, and we're hoping to allow, 15, 20 minutes for questions. There is a Q&A button down at the bottom. Just make sure, just as you think about them, drop your questions in there, and we'll look at those at the end, and we'll make sure we try and answer them all. If not at the time, then we can certainly respond later to people. But it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for this evening, Sarah Verkinova. Sarah's the head of international education at Bonard. Bonard is a collaborative research partner of Language Set and People Set, so I'm really pleased to have Sarah here. Bonard themselves are, I think one of the world's certainly most trusted research partners in international education, student mobility, purpose-built student accommodation, so all things important to our sector. Sarah has been a key part of Bonard's work for many years and comes to us with a great sort of depth of knowledge and experience across multiple markets. And I'm sure we're all going to learn a lot from her this afternoon. I'm certainly looking forward to this conversation. So, Sarah, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Fraser, and once again, welcome everyone. Thank you very much for having me here today to share a little bit more about the global student mobility trends from also data point of view. As Fraser already mentioned, and just let me briefly introduce Bonard. So we are an independent data and consultancy company that have been active in the international education space for 18 years already. And we work closely with the leading education associations, education providers, and also government bodies, including the Australian Department of Education, and at the same time support individual institutions in shaping their smarter, evidence-based recruitment strategies. And as part of our work, we also continuously monitor the global student mobility trends. And today, I would like to share a little bit more and show you kind of more broader macro level perspective on current patterns in the student flows, as well as zooming a bit more into the APAC region, along with sharing some results from latest research we did collaboratively with the People Cert on the employability. So without further ado, let me start with the presentation. I do believe, like, in response to the shifts that began in early 2024, we, of course, everyone seeing clearly the mobility redistribution away from the traditional Big Four, right? So we used to be, and actually what used to be a concentrated market is now really structurally diversifying. So instead of 4 dominant destinations, we are looking at 12 to 14 serious global competitors in the international education space. And this is no longer driven by student preferences alone, of course. So policy interventions, visa caps, pricing pressures, and also a post-study work regulations are actively reshaping the global student mobility flows. So before we zoom into APAC, it's important to ground it in the broader context. So mobility today is more fragmented, more competitive, and far more policy-driven than than before. And this is actually where the story becomes really tangible. So when the policy tightened in early 2024, students didn't pause, they just pivoted. And already in 2024, around 285,000 students chose alternative destinations instead of the traditional Big Four. At the same time, for 2025, we estimated at least another 165,000 redirected their plans. Structurally, that means that Big Four is now losing on the order of 100,000 students per year in the market share and the student population. But the importance is that it is not just more the redistribution at the scale. And what we are seeing is that students are recalibrating. So quality is still important, but so are the affordability, housing, safety, and also clear work rights. And the Big Four used to dominate across all of these four pillars in the past, and that today the value proposition felt kind of less predictable. So you have in Asia the places like Singapore, Tokyo, Hong Kong, and Malaysia as well, which are now attracting the attention, but capacity is limited at the moment in this region. So the real absorption is also happening elsewhere. So there is another destination coming into attention of many of international students, namely Germany, France, Spain, Italy as well, which is stepping into offering the affordability, academic strength, and more policy openness. So just to sum it up, students didn't disappear, they just simply moved and are moving to another destinations. And let me put the Big Four into a more macro perspective. So as mentioned at Bonard, we are tracking and analyzing the enrollment across 22 destinations, including Europe and Asia, to really understand how the mobility patterns are shifting at the moment. And at the global level, we see that demand for international education is still growing. It's growing around at 3% annually, driven, of course, by demographic, structural capacity gaps in developing systems and continued demand for high-quality programs with strong career outcomes. But when we look into that from enrollment standpoint, for 2024-2025 academic year, the Big Four remained broadly flat year on year. In contrast, Europe grew by 4%. And this is actually not a short-term volatility because since 2019, Europe has added 320,000 international students, which is a structural gain that signals really like sustained competitiveness. But the question is, of course, like what is driving the shift? And we already mentioned that. So just repeat that it's definitely the protectionist policies in the traditional English-speaking destinations, which are reshaping the mobility. At the same time, intra-Asian mobility is accelerating, namely Japan, Malaysia, South Korea, Hong Kong, which together reached over 522,000 higher education enrollment in this cycle, which we can talk about increase of 19% year on year. And at Bonard, we are also monitoring the student visa applications and student visa grants with the grant rates among Big Four and in New Zealand. And this data on the slides basically shows the demand side, so the visa application data, which tell us where students intend to go and where, and we also prepare for you for today's session, also a forecast scenario for 2026. But I would like to share that one thing is pretty much clear from this. So the demand today is no longer shaped by student preferences alone. Policy intervention is now a primary driver of mobility patterns. When we look into perspective of individual destination and starting with Australia, you can see that after a sharp decline and contraction through 2024 and early 2025, the decline is slowing. Demand appears to be finding a floor, and we estimate around 230,000 applications for 2025, which is roughly 9% down year on year. On the other hand, you can see Canada, which shows a much more sharper correction. So ongoing policy tightening has really driven applications down approximately by 51% year on year. And we see here one of the steepest decline among the Big Four. New Zealand then remains more in the recovery mode. Applications are still below the pre-pandemic levels. And we are talking about being down 6% year on year. And lastly, the UK, which pretty much stands out, and it is the only big four destinations actually showing the growth up to 7% in 2025, but still volumes are below the 2022 and 2023 peaks. But looking ahead to 2026, we expect some recovery in Canada and New Zealand, while the UK will likely stabilizes. And the key variable here across markets will be definitely the policy clarity and processing capacity. While the previous slide showed the applications, the following data shows you kind of the reality. And this is where also the intent meets the outcome. So the actual number of the students who were granted by student visa. And this is where global policy decisions start to visibly reshape the student mobility. So what we are seeing is not a uniform slowdown, but really a reshaping of global student mobility driven less by the demand and more by policy, cost, and the access itself. And the destinations that balance regulation with opportunity are really now holding the ground, while those tightening fastest are seeing the sharpest declines. So when we look into Australia, for this type of the analysis for today, we included here the data between Q1 and Q3 2025. And for Australia specifically, you can see that visa grants fell in most sectors, with postgrad study being actually one bright spot, up to 14% year on year. In Canada, the study permit caps and high visa refusal rates have led to significant declines across all sectors, with colleges contributing more than half of the total drop between or within the first 3 quarters of 2025. New Zealand, then you can see that it presents a little bit more stabilizing picture. And after a strong post-pandemic growth, 2025 intake levels have largely settled back to 2024 levels. And the UK continued to grow, and between first and third quarter of 2025, bachelor's visas increased by 12% and masters by 13%, which reflects also a stable, broad-based demand for the studying abroad. For specifically for the US, the US is expected to see a more significant decline, and then of course in pause in the visa interview slots in June last year, and the projected for 2025 intake down over 50% also pushed the F1 visa volumes more than 30% lower in 2025 and going into 2026. So when we move to the next, on the following slide, you can see the regional distribution of higher education student visa grants, and essentially where students are coming from and how the global mix is evolving over the time. And you can see here that Asia's share has edged down slightly, so from around 76% to roughly 73% over the period. But I think it's important to know that this is not a declining story. In absolute terms, the number of Asian students and visa grants remained really massive. Volume has grown strongly, and Asia really continues to be a structural backbone of the big four. But of course, the question is, what is driving the shift in this share? So firstly, I would probably just really briefly touch base on how the bottom number affects the result as well, because total student visa grant expanded significantly in the post-pandemic rebound, and other regions, particularly Africa and some parts of the Latin America, also grew a little bit faster than Asia itself. So even with a solid growth and volume, Asia's proportional share naturally eased. Second, it's the deliberate diversification. So institutions actively really expanded their recruitment beyond the China and India to reduce concentration risks. That also accelerated growth from Africa and parts of the Middle East, slightly diluting the Asia shares. And third, it's definitely the redistribution within the Asia itself. So the region remains dominant, but the internal composition is also changing. So growth from South and Southeast Asia is partially offsetting also a softer number coming from China. And I think this is the importance. So even within the Asia as a source region, diversification is now really essential for many of the education providers, and dependency on the one or two major markets is no longer sustainable. So we see that many strategies of the institutions are really shifting from Asia focused to Asia diversified. So just to sum it up and what is changing and how and where students are moving. So instead of following really a single linear pathway to traditional destinations, mobility is now becoming really more fragmented. So it's spread across hybrid and transnational education models, regional roads, and also growing number of emerging education hubs. And we're also seeing growing interest in the TNE and universities be present in the individual source market, like India, Vietnam, and many others. So just to sum it up, from destinational point of view, Europe is definitely projected to grow by 3 to 5%, benefiting from really diversification and relatively policy stability at the moment. Asia is expected to grow even faster, so at 10 to 15%, driven by affordability, improving quality, and really clear visa pathways to keep students closer to their homes. Intra-regional movement is accelerating, definitely within the Asia, was last year even within the Middle East, which also reshaped the global flows and reducing really on the reliance on a small number of traditional destinations. And with a global demand for international education rising, as mentioned as first part of the presentation, we anticipate that the growth we will see in the coming year will be 3% annually, driven by a growing student age population, supply-demand gaps in developing countries' education systems, and also, of course, the need for high-quality programs that deliver strong employment outcomes across the individual destinations. So within the English-speaking markets, the UK will definitely remain the top destinations, reaching around 758,000 enrollments and maintaining really like strong intakes throughout the 2027. The US follows closely but remains under pressure, of course. Australia will hold broadly stable. Canada, which declined sharply, and New Zealand will show a little bit more moderate growth from a smaller base. And the key takeaway for us is, I believe, pretty much clear, and it says that market is not shrinking, it's just reorganizing at the moment. So students are prioritizing this affordability, visa certainty, safety, and also the work right and destinations that offer policy openness and clear post-study pathways are actually best positioned to grow. And since we talk about the fact that the strategy now is shifting from Asia focused to Asia diversified, let me continue with the presentation to focus a little bit more on the Asia Pacific region. At the moment, the largest source region of international students globally, where we see that this picture becomes even more strategic. So, of course, we know that region accounts for over 55% of world's 6 million international mobile students, and also meaning more than every second globally mobile student comes from here. And the dominance is really structural. So China and India remains the core volume drivers. India continues to expand due to the demographic and domestic capacity gaps, while China, despite a declining young population, still delivers a volume to many of destinations. But the real shift is broader regional momentum. So going into Southeast Asia, a little bit more specifically, markets like Vietnam, Indonesia, Philippines, Thailand, Malaysia is one of the fastest growing outbound sub-regions, driven by rising middle classes and strong tertiary age population. When it comes to South Asia, the markets like Nepal, Bangladesh, or Pakistan also continues to generate like really strong demand, though often more visa and currency sensitive. And we see from it, like in the perspective of the Asia, it's definitely a multi-layered region. So you have large metro volume markets, then high growth emerging markets, and also increasingly diversified outbound patterns. But on the opposite side, and at the same time, you can see that several Asian destinations really now gaining a prominence and attracting students from the region, each for slightly different reasons. So in terms of the scale, Japan is currently the largest. Singapore also continues to play a key role as a traditional hub, given its long-standing reputation for high-quality education and its kind of strong position in regional center for international students. Malaysia. Malaysia is also one of the most dynamic growth stories. So in 2019-2020 academic year, there were around 50,000 international students. And by 2024-2025, the number had grown to almost 82,000. And the strongest growth actually came from China, but Malaysia has also gained visibility among students coming from Bangladesh and Myanmar. When we look into Japan and South Korea, we also noticed a notable growth. So between 2019 and 2025, Japan's international student numbers increased by 8%, which translated into about 24,000 international enrollments. South Korea, meanwhile, grew by about 30% over the same period. So across all of these markets, the same diverse keeps appearing. So affordability, proximity to home for many of the international students coming from the region, and also generous scholarships. So sometimes we see that these scholarships are also covering nearly 100% of the tuition. But as the numbers rise, so do questions as well. So how much additional growth can these systems realistically absorb in these destinations? And the biggest limitation for Asia as a study destination is definitely the capacity at the moment. And this system actually just cannot keep growing at the current pace forever. At some point, they will hit a ceiling, and building up the necessary infrastructure will definitely take the time for these destinations. If we look at the APEC student profile, I do believe like 3 patterns clearly stand out. Firstly, it's like really strong concentration in the commerce and IT segments. And for these analyses, we also use the data from the study portals, which consistently shows that business and management and computer science among the top 2 search fields for students from India, Vietnam, Indonesia, and Bangladesh. And according to study portals data in some South Asian markets, over 40 to 50% of outbound master searches are concentrated in these fields. So this reflects also clear ROI-driven decision-making among these students. Secondly, there is a clear preference for professionals, masters, and postgrad programs. So APEC mobility is heavily postgraduate driven, particularly from India and in China. And also demand is strongest for short career-oriented programs in analytics, AI, finance, and engineering, which are at the moment the degrees that delivers fast labor market outcomes. Third, we know that region is highly price and policy sensitive. So search behaviors and application volumes really shift quickly in response to the visa changes, work rights, and currency movements. In the markets like India, Nepal, or Bangladesh, even small regulatory adjustments can really redirect demand within the one intake cycle. So overall, the Asia Pacific and students coming from the region is career-focused, postgraduate oriented, and highly responsive to policy signals, which makes really regulatory clarity and absolutely critical for many of these students. When we move to the next, I do believe that there is no need to explain this in such much detail. So if we look at the higher education enrollments from the Asian Pacific source markets and towards the individual destinations, the recovery story is kind of clear and structural. So the big 4 still dominate in absolute scale, more than triple Asia's inbound numbers actually. However, Asia's growth trajectory is also notable because it reflects increasing regionalization of the mobility. Europe's growth is stable but more moderate, also suggesting a capacity constraints and tighter policy environments. And also this overall supports the broader shift we discussed earlier. Global mobility is diversifying both in outbound and inbound flows. When you want to look into more detailed destination level perspective, you can see here the growth levels on the right side of the slide, and the Asian Pacific students really remain the primary growth engine for many countries, still particularly Canada, UK, and parts of the continental Europe, which explains the strong post-2019 gains in those markets. At the same time, we see a clear policy effect. Australia show volatility linked to caps and visa tightening, while more open systems such as Malaysia expanded over this period. What is also visible is diversification. So growth is no longer concentrated in just one or two Western destinations. Secondary European markets and regional Asian hubs are capturing a larger share of the demand of students coming from the region. For the next two slides and the insights, as mentioned, we at Bonard, we are also monitoring the student visa grants across Big Four and in New Zealand. And this is precisely where I would say policy decisions become visible in hard data. And application data is one thing, but visa grants show us what actually converts. So we selected 4 key Asian Pacific source markets: India, China, Bangladesh, and Vietnam, to show you the momentum and also the student visa grant levels for going back to 2019 to 2025. And these markets were selected because together these, of course, represent both scale and growth momentum. Just really briefly started with China. So you can see a continuing softening trend. So in a Q1 and Q3 2025, the mobility has contracted further across most major destinations. And this also reflects a mix of demand decline and geopolitical factors. Then you have India, which presents a more fragmented picture. So in Q1 and Q3 2025, the UK actually recorded a renewed growth from India, while other destinations, particularly those with stricter visa settings, saw a really continued decline. And this clearly demonstrates how policy signals redirect flows rather than eliminate a demand itself. Bangladesh shows a really strong outbound demand, but convergence remains really highly dependent on the visa approval rates, which continue to constrain growth in several destinations. And Vietnam remains relatively stable across multiple study destinations, reflecting really more diversified and stable outbound profile. When we will continue with Vietnam, we see a decline in outbound volumes. This reflects also the demographic pressure, shrinking young population, combined with a stronger domestic higher education options and regional study alternatives. And you can see then, in case of the Sri Lanka, which shows a little bit different patterns, as there was a clear peak in 2023 to 2024 driven by pent-up demand and following economic instability. High visa refusal rates in some destinations are now also constraining the conversions. Indonesia presents a more stable growth story, and the volumes are gradually increasing, supported by a large tertiary age population and really expanding middle class in the country. And this is the medium-term growth market rather than a volatile one. Following, and you can see the Thailand, which remained relatively stable over the measured period and also between 2023, 2024 and going into 2025. Mobility here is more diversified and less reactive compared to South Asian markets. And lastly, Philippines shows a relatively stable performance, yet regional study options within the Asia increasingly absorb part of the demand and the student mobility. So while we talk about the grants and visa approval rates here, you can see the summary of the selected markets and their student visa grant rates among the largest destinations, like namely Big Four and New Zealand. At a glance, visa grant rates really remain relatively high across most Asian Pacific markets, but with significant variation by destinations, of course. So the UK currently records the strongest and most consistent approval performance. Grant rates are near universal across many South East Asian markets, often between 95 to 100%. New Zealand also shows a very high and stable grant rates across most markets, frequently about 90%. But for Australia, approval rates are generally strong in Northeast and Southeast Asia, but more mixed in several parts of South Asia, particularly India, Myanmar, or Thailand. And this variability also directly impacts the flow volatility. When we look into Canada, it shows the greatest variations. So while the approval rates are strong in the markets like Taiwan and Cambodia, they are significantly lower in Bangladesh, India, Sri Lanka, or the Philippines. And this also explains some of the redistribution we saw in the outbound flows throughout the 2025. But what is ahead of us? And when we look into anticipated volume of the applications for 2026, we prepare a couple of forecasts and of course these scenarios. And on these selected markets of China, Vietnam, South Korea, Indonesia, Taiwan, and Philippines. And probably starting with China, because for the markets, our projections anticipate a decline from 257,000 applications in 2023 to around 208,000 by 2027. And this is really kind of structural softening driven by demographics, geopolitics, and stronger regional options to stay within the Asian region. South Korea shows quite similar patterns, modest declines, largely demographic-led. And in contrast, Vietnam and Indonesia are really expected to remain stable with a slight growth expected, supported by expanding middle class and sustained outbound demand by the end of 2027. For Taiwan, we anticipate that the market stays broadly stable, reflecting really metro mobility patterns. And the clear slowdown appears to be in the Philippines, where applications dip and then plateau, partly due to the regional absorption and policy sensitivity. So the overall Big Four and the New Zealand are also moving into phase of selective growth, with the legacy market softening and Southeast Asia playing an increasingly important stabilizing role in the sector. So just to sum it up, this part, the slides and the insights kind of summarize the core message, saying that APEC is no longer the optional; it's really strategic. And first, from a volume perspective, Asia Pacific delivers really both undergraduate scale and strong postgrad and graduate margin, particularly in professional master's programs across Southeast Asia. Second, it's definitely the fact that diversification, even within the region, is critical. So institutions can really reduce the overexposure to saturated market by building depth in second-tier APEC countries where outbound momentum is rising at the moment. And third, it's definitely that the employability matters. So career outcomes, post-study work rights, and migration positioning increasingly really determine the competitiveness, especially for private and specialist providers within the sector. And finally, as more students choose to stay within the region and within the Asia, we see that institutions outside of the region must really differentiate. So through niche programs, flexible deliveries, and clear graduate outcomes to attract these students to enroll. At the program level, demand really remains concentrated in technology, engineering, healthcare, sustainability, and the business analytics, which are all aligned with the regional workforce gaps we observe in these markets. And the key takeaways, I would say, it's quite simple, and I'd say Asia Pacific is a scale, margin, and a future growth, but only for the institutions with a really structured and differentiated strategy. And I do believe this is where one of the research we did in the collaboration with a language search provided over 2025. And we actually conducted a global survey to better understand the future study intentions of young professionals and recent graduates. And importantly, this research goes beyond the traditional degree pathways, and in an evolving job market at the moment, shaped by digital transformation, AI adoptions, and shifting employer expectations, many professionals at the moment feel that formal higher education alone is no longer sufficient. Of course, universities often cannot just adapt curricula as quickly as labor markets change, which is driving growing interest in shorter, flexible upskilling and certification options alongside or after the graduation. And therefore, the study we conducted also explored respondents' intention to pursue the additional education or certification while employed. And it also examined the preferences for delivery formats, study destinations, emerging programs types, with the analysis segmented by national background. And the finding in itself, I would say, highlight kind of clear trends. So skill enhancement, professional development, and also continuous learning are now central to career progression and long-term employability. So the survey was conducted between April 14 and 2020 in last year, 2025, where we were able to obtain 10,000 responses. And from Asian Pacific region, the survey captured almost 1,000 respondents, really providing a strong regional lens within the global data set. And moving to the key outcomes from the research and the survey, you can note that a striking 92% of the respondents really plan to pursue further studies, underscoring a strong commitment to really continued learning. And one of the key messages comes from the research. So skill enhancement, professional development, and also further education are now essential, are really inseparable from a modern workplace. And these motivations predominantly included upskilling, increasing competitiveness in the job market, and also strengthening professional profiles. And I would also share that this trend was especially prominent among the respondents with undergrad or high school level education, where over 50% actively planned to continue their studies. Even among those with graduate level qualifications, 49% still intend to pursue the further development. 61% of the respondents also indicated that their primary goal was to develop professional skills to enhance their professional effectiveness, adaptability, and also overall contribution in the workplace. And this was closely followed by a focus on building advanced expertise and field-specific skills. Among those aiming to deepen their field-specific knowledge, and most frequently reported areas were actually IT, computer science, and followed by business and management. The research itself also showed that motivation really varied significantly by region, closely reflecting current trends in the international education sector in general. So, for instance, in North America, Africa, and Southeast Asia, the focus was largely on the upskilling to deepen the expertise within their fields, while in Asia and the Middle East, soft skill development was identified as the most important goal. At the same time, with a rising cost of the living and certification programs, cost was actually highlighted as one of the most important factors for respondents when deciding to pursue further studies. And also in line with the global education trends, reputation and ranking of the institutions really still remain the top priority for respondents coming from Asia, with 58% citing this as their key consideration. Flexibility actually ranked as the second most important factors, especially for individuals in their productive working years, aged between 25 to 54, who often need to balance work and further qualification or study. But interestingly, Gen Z respondents really placed even stronger emphasis on reputation and rankings, showing that the institutional prestige continues to matter to younger learners. When respondents were also asked about their preferred mode of learning, online education clearly emerged as the dominant choice. So, however, I would say it's also important to know that for more than half of the respondents, the location of the institutions and also whether it's domestic or foreign one does not really significantly impact their decision. What matters most to them were definitely the program, and whether the program itself actually met their needs for requalification or pursuing the further studies. what we noticed throughout the research work is also the fact that the results pretty much mirror the global trends, with the respondents showing a strong interest in the specialized further studies and upskilling in emerging fields within the IT and computer science, followed by business and management. And these findings also reflect a broader shift towards the technology-driven learning as really professionals aim to future prove their skills and adapt to the evolving demand of modern industries we currently observe. This trend is clearly reflected in the survey, where 56% of the respondents really expressed a desire to pursue further education or skill development in these areas. And at the same time, we already touch base a little bit on the challenges, but you can see here even the split by world region. And you can notice that financial constraints were identified as the biggest challenge in the traditionally more price-sensitive region, particularly Africa and the Middle East, and ranked as a second in Latin America. In Southeast Asia, where there is a strong focus on more specialized program-driven education, one of the main challenges, which was actually ranked third, appears to be finding the right institution or relevant program. It also suggests that in some regions, the obstacle is affordability, while in others, it's more about the program relevance and the availability, both of which significantly impact the future study opportunities and the options. And I do believe that also gives you a little bit better context of what graduates and young professionals are now looking into. Also when they are pursuing their upskilling to respond to changes in the job market. And also I would say, highlights how individual institutions can really better support job preparedness. Many of their graduates, and as said, like, we are focusing on a generation that really place a strong emphasis on ROI as the key objective of their studies, along with really improved employability prospect. So I do believe that this provides you a little bit with clearer context on what graduates and young professionals are looking for. And I probably given a floor back to Fraser. Thank you very much for the attention. And if there will be any questions, I'm definitely happy to answer these.
Thanks so much, Sarah. That was fascinating. A lot of really dense information packed into a short time period, and a lot to unpack there. I think looking at global trends. There's quite a number of questions coming. But before we start, I just thought I'd give a little bit more background onto the research that Bonard did together with Language Cert and People Cert. The data came from, we're lucky enough, I suppose, because we are an employment-focused organization, the bigger company with career professionals, that we have a database of more than 3 million young, sort of upwardly mobile career professionals who've taken all our workplace career qualifications. So we were able to look at that to give us some of the data that informed the research as a different demographic normally from your normal sort of undergraduate, postgraduate students. These were from, young professionals in the workplace. So I think it gave quite a nice a different lens to look at what they were looking at. I was stunned by the research, the findings that Sarah and the Bonard team came up with, that 92% were actually either currently or were planning to look at further education, which just shows you that there's a whole range of untapped potential students out there looking for the right course, depending on where you look at the data. But anyway, I'll jump into some of the questions. The first one was obviously, are we going to share the content with people, Sarah, after the presentation?
Yeah,
Which I think,
absolutely. Yeah, we are happy to share the slides.
yeah,
So this will
definitely
be, I
share the
guess,
slides. Yeah.
distributed by Language Cert team. Yeah.
Yeah, if you've registered, we'll send it out to you. Another one that's coming was just sort of looking at them now. If you were an international student, sort of recruitment director at the moment, looking forward, where would you be spending your and your team's time and effort and resources?
Right. And it's a really interesting question because I do believe that for many institutions at the moment, the situation is a lot about the uncertainty, in which market to go into, where to allocate their budgets, with these really immediate and quick shifts in the student preferences. Where we are looking always in the recruitment activities of either our clients, when advising. I think it's definitely about, let's say, allocating the resources in the markets where you are currently present and already have a footprint and your partners network, especially through the education agencies. So I do believe that now what we see, such huge expansion in new markets, it's not definitely on the radar of many institutions. Of course, there are a couple of markets that are at the moment kind of emerging, but at the same time, this market requires higher investment. So therefore, the partnerships the institutions have and already established in the source market, we found it as really important to be present there, to support their partners, to discuss, to update your partners, to know like what is happening within your destination, how you can actually support the students to come to your institution. So I do believe like that part of the communication stream and communication in general, it's one of the most important components you can give to your partners and the students. So I do hope I answer your question. But generally speaking, look into the markets where you are present, where you have established network, and not really highly expand the markets. However, the diversification is now even more important than any time before.
Thank you. I think it was well answered. And there's another one that sort of leads on from that a little bit, which is, do you see with the growth away from the traditional sort of big four markets and some of those sort of newer, emerging, growing destination markets, do you think what is it, the large sort of shift towards some of those in a short period of time, do you think that's going to bring with them regulatory changes, over the next 1 to 2 years as they suddenly find themselves, perhaps a center of attention from certain countries where the visa application process might be a little bit easier?
Absolutely. We already see the shifts, as mentioned during the presentation, going into certain markets of Europe, students staying within the Asia, where these destinations are a little bit more open to international students that traditionally our traditional big four destinations. We saw the growth across markets and interesting destinations like, for instance, Switzerland, Poland, Portugal as well. But on the other hand, you have also the markets, for instance, within the Europe, and the destinations within the Europe, which are not, of course, so open to international students. So you can see that like Netherlands is cutting down the number of English taught programs. However, we definitely see the growth momentum for Asia. Also, it goes in hand with the increase of TNE, and the new campus openings in even in the individual source markets. So there will be shifts. They're already happening. Students are looking into either stay within their region, studying through TNEs, or looking into affordable options within Europe and Asia in general.
Hmm. I think there's a follow-on sort of question to that one within there about TNE. Do you anticipate as sort of the big four, the traditional sort of markets begin to see, well, to some degree, a decline, that there's going to be a growth in TNE? And if so, which regions or countries are you seeing evidence of growth for transnational,
Yeah,
both to
right. I do believe like it gives UK give us really nice example of it. So based on their new international education strategy, they wanted to increase the higher education export in the form of the TNE. You might notice that a lot of institutions from the UK are also submitting the letter of interest to Indian government to open their own campuses in the market. Um, Similarly, Australia is still gaining or having the prominence in the sector with strong TNE footprint in the Southeast Asian region. A lot of universities also opening their or opened their campuses to benefiting from the demand side of the international education and wanting to study with the institution abroad. On the other hand, you have Canada and the US, which are not so much developed in the TNE are now, and that's also the way and the reason why they are losing the market share in this segment at the moment as well. At the same time, if I can give you a specific example on China, we see also that there is a lot of players now looking into China to establish their new programs, new joint initiatives to all degrees as well, since Chinese students are becoming now more price sensitive than before. Of course, the ranking and the reputation of the institution will be still number one consideration for these students and the parents, but the parents themselves are now also looking into more affordable options, either staying within the region or studying through TNE or different types of the collaboration agreements between institutions.
Hmm. That's fascinating. That segues into another question that's on there about the predicted decline of 15% in the Chinese student market. Where do you think that decline is going to be felt most? If
I
you
do
were,
believe that we already see this decline, especially on the student numbers that are coming uh, to Big Four, either to the UK, US, Australia as well. This is definitely China is declining market.
Mm,
We know that, of course, because of the demography of the market itself. Of course, it's still the market that generates a volume. So it's not going to disappear from one year to another, but this is something we have to count with, um, that the market will be declining predominantly on the onshore, basically studying within that specific destinations, either it's Canada, UK, Australia, US. Um, However, um, yeah, I guess I lost the thought I wanted to follow up on that. Um, but
that's
I
all right.
said the decline we currently see it's going to be, and we already see is directly in the individual destinations and the student population. But of course, there are the markets there that can actually offset the decline of the China. So, and we are already seeing it. Of course, it's India, it's Nepal, it's Bangladesh, but this is like totally different student profile that the institutions are attracting.
Mm,
Um, so this is something they will have to adapt. They're looking and because they're looking into markets which are more price sensitive, and they're even able to make much more quicker decisions on changing their student preference or the destination compared to Chinese students in the past.
no, absolutely. There's a few more questions in here. I'll see if we can try and get through some of these and get answers from Sarah before. Um, This is quite an interesting one here. Is all growth around, or all the growth that you've seen in the research around English medium programs, or has there growth in other lingua francas emerged in the international student sector, for example, German, French, or Chinese?
Right. Thank you very much for this question because this is even interesting topic for me to look into. In the past, there have been always certain number of students who don't necessarily just studied in the programs in the English within the Europe. They were enrolled in the German, French, or any other local language programs. However, English will still be a dominant part of their decision, and they will be predominantly looking into the programs that are taught in English.
Hmm. All right, thank you. It's last probably one or two now. Here's an interesting one, which I think is quite pertinent given the and you mentioned it yourself, the generation ROI and the focus on employability skills that came up and came out through the research. Certainly something that we're passionate about. But someone else has raised it here. And then should universities look to be offering their international students more accessibility to both personal and professional development courses pre-arrival, which I guess is maybe, to try and augment, I'm presuming, augment their degree offerings.
Absolutely. I do believe so. When we are even doing as part of our research work is we are sometimes talking to students. We are gathering their feedback. What attract them, what is the most attractive part and why they are basically decided for the institutions, what they would like to see more from the side of the institutions in terms of the support and definitely the professional development to have professional development courses as part of their curricula is definitely also there. They are looking into, they're also consider. It goes also in hand with the soft skills development. So not only the hard skill through the individual courses, but also this opposite part of the education they are
Hmm.
looking into.